Hey everyone, and thanks for watching this video for startups where I will introduce you to the best practices of software development and outsourcing, and in particular, how to manage your tech team. So let's get started. I'll briefly introduce myself so that you understand why I'm talking about how to manage a tech team for startups today. I've been born in Lausanne in Switzerland. I have a degree in business administration and business development. I've been also working in the finance industry for almost 10 years, where I've been setting up operational and non-operational teams for big projects. Later on, I joined a company to work on a portfolio management system, so it was a software company. Then I moved to Hong Kong to start working on an e-commerce venture selling virtual assets and managing parts of the operations and the relocation of the company to the Philippines, where I ended up co-founding Arcanys, which has more than 120 people today, including 80 software engineers. And we've recently founded Arcanys Labs, where I'm a partner, where we actually teamed up with a venture capital firm for investments up to $200,000 in cash and services. We've handled over 200 tech projects so far. We've invested in about 6 startups in Switzerland, the UK, Thailand, and Australia. We're a resource partner in FinTech Fusion, which is the first FinTech accelerator in Switzerland, and I'm also a mentor at the Swiss FinTech Association. Lastly, I'm collaborating on one NGO in early education in Cebu, which is the Arcanys Foundation, where we teach math to underprivileged kids through parenting. So why this topic? So since 2010, we've worked with several hundreds of teams, and we've measured all the ways teams could work more efficiently, and also have witnessed a lot of setups that were bound to fail. So over the years, we have perfected our model to make sure that we increase the chances of success of any project we work on. We're so confident about the value that we can deliver that we actually also invest in startups we believe in, and where we know we can make a huge difference in the speed of commercial development of the startups. We're both investors and providers, working for a much later payment if the company is successful, which means we're willing to take the risk of working along with a team to boost their chances of success with no direct payment. For example, one of the startups we have worked with, but unfortunately not invested in, has been sold to a bigger group for more than 10 million US dollars, and our team is at the core of their success because their team is bigger at Arcanys than in their actual offices in Sweden. We're now increasing the collaboration with the company that purchased them because they always wanted to outsource but failed 3 times. So we have to prove them now that outsourcing can work when the two partners are right for each other and work together. Another example is a startup we have invested in at the very start and have managed to create some traction and a product good enough to get funding of $500,000 for 500 Startups Asia, and is now valued at about $5 million, which is a lot in Asia compared to the US. And so I would like you to think about the main struggles in your tech today, or what are your questions related to the topic of this video today. You can simply write them down in the comments, and we'll try to get to answer to them. So now let's dig in more detail with the topic of the day. Basically, when you work in tech, there are 2 main things to look after. The first thing is people, their roles, the knowledge, and how to manage them. And on the other side, you have the processes, when to use them and how to use them. So let's start with the people and roles. So in technology, there are a lot of different roles. Some of them can be the same person, but it's not the case for all of them. So let me go through them. You have graphic designers, UI, UX designers. So she's the person who will help you define the look and feel of your application for the user and the admin parts. The business analyst, which will usually work before or together with the designer to work on the requirements and specifications of a project. So the BA's role is to understand the processes, map them, describe what users need, and help the designer, along with the founders, come up with the features, look and feel of the application. Once the requirements are known and validated, at least for the MVP, there's that this is when the developers come into place. So there's the front-end developer, which is the kind of developer who will program the visible part of the application that the users and admins will interact with, while the back-end developer is the developer who will take care of the server and API side, where the heavy lifting of the application happens. A developer that masters both skills is a full stack developer. And a relatively new term is DevOps, even more so with cloud technologies, where the DevOps is a hybrid between a developer and someone who also understands infrastructure, QA automation, hardcore cloud, or physical server issues. Then the architect is a high-level developer that makes software design choices and sets the technical standards, including coding standards, tools, and platforms. Usually this is the role of the CTO in a startup, and most of the time we think the CTO should be a central person or even a co-founder in technology startups. Then comes the tester, which is an often forgotten role, but we think they're central to building a product because they are one of the guarantees of the reliability of the software when delivered. They are testing the application both on a user point of view and on a technical or performance point of view to make sure that the application is working as expected. This is important. It is important to mention that the best is that the tester is a different person than the developer, simply because it's two different jobs and no developer is very good at testing its own code. In some cases, there is a need for a project manager, but most of the time this role is, at least with us, played by the lead developer. We think that every person in a technological project must be technical, and this is no exception for the project manager. Usually, a project manager role is adding a layer in a project and is prone to conveying misunderstandings, so we like to have this role blended with the lead developer as long as the team is not too big. And lastly, the product owner is the person who is in charge of the vision of what he wants to build and conveys that vision to the team. Usually this is the client or one of the founders. And there are usually a lot of processes to keep in mind. As you can see here, at Arcanys we have about 200 people, including on the client side, that are working at any given time on about 20 concurrent projects. So we can't mess with information. And at any given time, we need to be in control of our project and know what's happening. Especially so we have to do this on a daily basis. And so for a startup, a few simple processes need to be in place to increase chances of success, and I'll go through them. First one is managing requirements. Then we need to, when we are working on a lean software methodology, I will explain to you why we have to be careful with this concept. Then we need to estimate the features of a project and the project as a whole, create an architecture design based on the specifications of the application, managing the team, of course, and its communication, and of course, never forget user and software testing. So maybe you could think about which are the processes you are not following, or maybe the reason why you're not following them. And secondly, if there's a process you are doing and you're struggling with, and why. So the number one risk factor is the mismanagement of the specifications and business requirements. I know that everything is kind of urgent in a startup, and of course, building the MVP is also really urgent. But when we're building the tech, there are fast and slow phases, so some things can be rushed, even though the pressure to push something out is really high. So we think that neglecting the requirements is one of the most costly mistakes. And heads down to programming your product without thinking about the whole picture can be really, really deadly for startups. And some founders have a hard time sitting down to focus on requirements. Here or there, they have a bit of time, but they'd rather write a few lines quickly and ask a tech guy to price or estimate and deliver something. And so working on the first version of the product is the most important task, hands down, for a startup or any kind of other project. So it's even more important than raising money and finding clients. Every month, we have to dig in projects that have not been well specified, and it's a really, really big nightmare to fix these. And usually it's more costly than to start from scratch. But starting from scratch is slowing down the release of new features in the short term, and this can also be really a problem when you're facing tough competition. So the number one risk factor is the mismanagement of specifications and of the business requirements, and you need to be careful about this. So I think building a house is a very good analogy when you think about building your first project, your first product. For example, we have clients who come to us with a one pager and of what they really want to build, and it looks like the sketch on the left basically. And they're like, hey, how much will it cost, and how much will it take? How much time will it take? Well, what do you think? Does this look like a little hut in the jungle or a big mansion with a swimming pool? Um, I, I really think at this point we can't tell. There are too many uncertainties, and whoever would give a price and a timeline for this sketch is actually making big mistakes, a big mistake. And if your requirements aren't clear, you're kind of forcing your developers to, or your provider to make guesses that on your behalf, as well as planning for you, changing your mind all the time until you have what you want. So this kind of pushes you into a messy project that very likely will last much longer than you actually want. And if someone gives you a fixed timeline or even a fixed price, expect them to come back later with like additional requests in terms of time or payments. The price will go up and the project will take longer if it ever actually gets released because of also architectural design, which will have failed. And so after having worked on hundreds of projects, we don't work on projects where the specifications are poorly done. We always push our clients to work on their requirements by themselves with our guidance, or we work with them to finish them. And I actually have written a small ebook that might be helpful to understand what is needed, and you can actually email me if you would like to receive it. I'll give my contact details at the end of this presentation. So when you build requirements, who do you actually need? There are mainly three roles that matter when building requirements. It's the designer, the business analyst, and the product owner. There's also the potential user. I'll talk about this later. So it might not always be three different people because some can fill two roles at the same time. And other stakeholders can also give their input and share their opinion, but you have to be careful. They should not always be listened to. For example, a tester or a developer might think of technical impediments to building the system and suggest things that make him comfortable, or avoid things that he might feel too hard to build, rather than to think about the best functionality for the user. First, you should come up with the ideal tool you really want for your users. Then you turn to your developers and ask them to how much time they need to build each functionality. You can think of Apple, where the products always kind of start from a design perspective and then goes to the engineers, and not the other way around. Excuse me. And so here is an example of UI, UX design and requirements document. So once your requirements are well done, you should have something like wireframes or with final design, which is much better, in an interactive prototype with a simple written requirements document that describes the business rules and business logic behind your system. And in this slide, you see that the designs also explain the flow between the screens and the actions from each button. This is very important to describe to whoever will work on your project. And so most of the time when we receive requirements, the entire admin section is missing. So most people only think their product as an end user facing app, but actually forget about all the management and reporting features that you as a business owner should have. And one very important step is to have all the decision makers agree on the design of your application, at least for the MVP. You should probably also get feedback from a few prospects, but you need to be careful with it. Most clients don't know too well what they need and will ask you a lot of additional features. So they might not understand the technology and can't always imagine themselves using the software. So you might hear a lot of suggestions that sound good, but you must also be careful about scope creep. You need to decline most ideas in your MVP and stick to the core functionalities that are needed for this first shippable product. So let's talk a bit about lean software methodology for startups. Well, it's usually a very good methodology. You may want to be careful about using this for your MVP when you're tight on cash. And basically, which startup isn't? Building the first version of your MVP is when you really need to sort out the design and the requirements and build a product you can ship and test within your timelines and your budget. Budgets are not always extensible and the competition doesn't wait for you. So when you have your first product and your first users, this is when you can work more easily with fast iteration about your product without necessarily planning for the next features. This might help you get a better product, and if you have a strong adherence to the principles and you manage to get rapid customer feedback, this is when you can benefit from it. And we've seen it happen with a few customers who were not that disciplined in various areas. And if we didn't put them back on track, they could have doubled their budget for the MVP with a lot of stuff developed for nothing, then trashed when they change their minds. One good way to get validation is to integrate the designs in the design in prototyping tools. They give a feel of the use of the app without coding anything. We use either InVision or Proto.io. Okay, so now we'll talk about one extremely important process that most developers hate, and they usually and unfortunately skip this step, but this leads to important project delays between what is expected and what really happens. Basically, it's like telling your friend that you will meet them at point B at a given time, but don't even bother checking how to get there because, for example, you've never done it and no one else has. So how much time it will take, if there's traffic or not, and worse, what means of transportation will you take to go from A to B? And you tell them you can do everything in an hour. I think you have 99% of chances you'll be late or that you'll actually never make it. So how do you estimate your project? First, it only works if the project is well defined with detailed specifications and design of the UI. Once you have your specifications, developers will break down the specifications in what we call user stories that should be chunks of work of 1 to 8 hours generally. If it's bigger than 8 hours, it means that it can be broken down further and or that the understanding of the task is not enough and needs to be further clarified. So this process usually takes a lot of time, but saves so much time down the road that it's the best way to start. Also, knowing how much time each feature takes allows you to better plan and prioritize how your application will be built. The end result will likely shock you in terms of how many hours it will take, and it's normal because we always think things will go quicker than they actually do. So, have you guys gone through this process, or if not, is there anything that prevented you from doing it? And if you haven't done it, have you encountered delays and other issues in your project that you think the estimation and breaking down of user stories could have helped you avoid? So besides forcing the breakdown of a complex project into smaller, more manageable tasks, it also helps the client validate the features and the product that they have been well understood. It allows to separate their project into phases as well. As I mentioned earlier, most of the time business people do not realize how much time each of the functionalities they have in mind really take. So this helps make smarter business decisions. If they don't have access to this information, they will keep on throwing ideas thinking they're all quickly done and that each one of them takes more or less the same amount of time to accomplish. But in reality, some features might take 20 hours to build and some others 200 hours. But once you give the visibility to the product owner, then they can assign dollar amounts to the functionalities and decide what to remove and what to keep for later. And so once you're set with what you want to build now and later, it's time to look at the architectural design. This is a very simple example, but developers may think about how they will put the system in place along with the architect in charge of the project. And along with the estimated dev time, your developers should produce an architectural diagram where they could explain to you how the system will interact together. This work of thinking of the architecture of the system needs to be done no matter what, and it's better to do it as early as possible. Of course, they might review it as time goes. So, did you plan the architectural design before? If not, did you guys struggle with the architecture review system later? And so once you're ready with your requirements and know how you should build your system and how many hours of work are necessary, this might be the time when you want to scale from the 1 to coding founders to a few developers and ship the MVP within 2 to 4 months. This is one of the options where outsourcing can be the most useful. You can add a few developers to ship your product and easily can reduce the team size after the initial launch if you don't have enough cash to maintain an entire team, because competition doesn't wait for you to be done. And so when ramping up your team, you should really watch out for project managers. Even as a big company, we try to avoid them as much as possible. We need them when the clients are not technical to make a buffer between the business and the developers, because the communication mismatch and crazy added features issue can happen often. We usually recommend our technical clients to directly talk to our lead developer, who will do maybe 10 to 20% of his time as a project manager, which anyways has to be done by speaking with the PM if there is a PM. And we notice that mistakes, does this make projects more efficient when we have no project manager? And we also have noticed that adding layers in a project can most of the time increase risks of error when relaying the specifications. And so you also want to make sure that your team is using proper tools to manage the project. In our case, we use Jira, and we even have a tool that automatically uploads the user stories we have created for our estimations in a specific in-house software with the time estimates, and creates, of course, a task for each one. Like this, we can organize projects, phases, and we can know if we're on track compared to what we have estimated, understand the problems, and correct them as quickly as possible. Our clients and the project managers have constant access to this information and receive daily updates where they can check the discrepancies and understand where the team struggles and fix it before it's too late. And one of the most underestimated functions in a software project is testing, and the value of a professional tester. If there's no tester, the founders will spend actually a lot more time doing testing. And while the functional testing can be well done by founders, a lot of other aspects can be missed. So professional testers are usually specifically trained for this task and add a lot of value in saving some development time and increasing the quality of the shipped product. And in addition, testers used standardized practices to handle their tasks quickly, with writing test cases, executing these test cases, writing bug reports with how to reproduce them. This saves a lot of time for developers and cost to the founders. And so once they have a sort of an MVP that you can push, do it. Don't wait to be perfect, but it needs to be usable. Then when you push it to them, you got to make sure that you watch your users use your software and talk to them and understand what they do and why they do it and what is missing, etc. Then fix what doesn't work until you get real stickiness. Depending on the business model, this means whether they can keep using it, or even if they are willing to pay something for it. Don't spend too much time in marketing until you get something that really works. Otherwise, you'll simply throw money out of the window. And so let's talk about outsourcing best practices or working with an agency near you. If you decide to work with an outsourcing provider and more freelancers in another country to reduce costs, you have to be very careful with the differences between the countries, because there's a way to work with each culture. And if you don't understand that and manage different people the way you do with people in your own culture, you may not end up having the results you expect and even have misunderstandings. So you better make sure you understand uh, who you're working with and their culture. And there is an interesting book about this one. It's When Cultures Collide. So maybe a question for you guys is, have you experienced some cultural issues in your project so far, or have you worked around with them? Have you stopped working with some people because you thought you were having too many communication issues? Another thing is about fixed cost projects. I know most people like the idea of to have fixed cost projects to mitigate the risk. But with years of experience, we and the majority of the industry have experienced that it works only in the cases where the project is extremely well defined. This works, for example, for a small and well-defined mobile application, but for the rest, really, it rarely works because there's always someone losing. If, like in most cases it happens, the provider underestimates a project, not enough requirements, or not senior enough, or not the right processes, or lots of misunderstandings, once a provider has spent the amount of hours he said he would spend, he's going to start cutting corners and decrease the quality of the product. And after a while, he will ask for more money, otherwise he ditches the project. So this really can kill you. On the other hand, if he has overbilled you, he will earn a lot and you will lose. This rarely happens because if you do your job in evaluating the right provider and evaluate maybe 3 to 4 providers, this shouldn't happen to you. Usually providers go for fixed prices, and when they do this, they will give you a low price to get the project and trick you later by asking some more money because this and this and that, and well, that was not specified, and if you want to have it, then you need to pay more. So I also have written a little ebook about evaluating a provider, and you can request it by sending me an email. And in addition, in fixed price projects, providers will try to limit collaboration with you because it takes a lot of time and they want to avoid the client to try to add features along the way that are not in the initial scope. This results in loss of flexibility, which usually is vital for a startup. So, question, have you had a good or bad experience with fixed cost projects? And could you share some of these experiences? And do you have questions about this model? Another thing we see pretty often is that the clients that come to us because they have problems with their current provider, who, for example, has built the entire system on a proprietary framework on their own. And I think this is a big issue because most of the time it's an outdated technology and it's very hard to work on these projects without having to restart from scratch. So make sure you work on a technology your provider is proficient with, but that is also widespread with a striving community that is up to date and that will be easy to hand over. This is one of the few steps to keep yourself more independent from a single provider or freelancer. Another issue we see sometimes is that some clients do not have complete control over their source code, and when the relationship with their provider turns sour, the providers cut access to the latest source code. And if you never get the code back, it can take someone a few hard months of work to salvage a project and hence delay the shipping of a product or miss a lot of revenues from new features. So make sure you have your own big bucket, GitHub or GitLab, for example. Also, putting clauses to your team members on board. So a lot of providers put their A team for you at the beginning of a project, then switch to more junior people. If you are in a monthly contract, the provider should commit to keep the developers on the project or compensate when they change for some reason. A real partner will work with you to develop the people in the project and make sure you get the most out of your relationship and the learning of the people. Think about an extension of your own employees that stay on the long term with you. So you have to understand what the provider does to make sure that they will do everything to reduce the attrition rate. Well, this has been covered above, but if you work with a provider, make sure he's at least as organized as you are. And for us, we've picked Jira as our project management tool. And one other thing important is that you always have to have a high-level architect involved in the project. If he's the architect of the provider, make sure he has the experience required for the job, as bad architectural choices can create issues down the road. If you're not sure about the skills of your architect or one of the provider, you can hire someone a few hours to validate the architecture of the solution. This is small cost, but that can save you a lot of hassles down the road. And one thing we really look at when we work with a startup, and even more importantly when we invest in a startup, is that we want to make sure they have a coding CTO. This adds a lot of value to the project and also to the startup when you want to raise funds. It means that, at least on paper, that the technology is key in-house, and that the knowledge is mastered in-house too. And this person should establish coding standards super early to make sure that everyone's coding the same way, which in turn facilitates onboarding and transitions. The coding CTO should do frequent code reviews, and this is scientifically proven to be the best investment you can do to increase the quality of your product, but also to train your team as quickly as possible. So this is a very, very important point. And this is also really helping the team to stick together and share experiences, point of views, and fast track their development. It's a great coaching and mentoring tool. So how often do you guys make code reviews in your projects? So always keep in mind the cost of delays for an MVP. This is something people underestimate often. You need to be ruthless when removing features. Every day your product doesn't hit the market has financial costs or missed revenue, the cost of paying your developers to get stuff done, maybe the unpaid founders, or how about your competitors gaining traction while you're still in development and haven't shipped anything. So don't try to build the best product in the world and fine tune it over and over. You don't need to be a perfectionist, right? And Reid Hoffman said, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've probably launched too late. And I have a few examples here about building an imperfect tool. For example, Stripe, they're a payment company, and so when they launched, they created merchant account very quickly by doing stuff manually to see if they had some traction. So they were even faxing papers to create the merchant accounts and only launched their automated onboarding months later. But in the meantime, they took the market and crushed the competition. Same thing for Airbnb. For the first 3 years, the CEO was living at host places in California, became an advocate of his company, and knew the clients super. So before we finish, I just would like to present you a few videos and books for inspiration. So the main one is the Blitzscaling series on YouTube, and the number 10 and 11 are really good for explaining about how to build an evolving product and hiring developers. And then at the bottom of the slide, you can see a few of our favorites. One other video that you could watch is Steve Blank, the customer development process, and a few books that I really liked that are really different. Both of them are really different. Is the first one, the biography of Elon Musk by Ashley Vance, and the second one is Disrupted, my misadventure in the startup bubble, which is actually really good and pretty funny. So one last thing is, how does the Arcanys Labs or Arcanys help startups? We basically get hired for development and get paid, but we also are interested in getting stakes and helping startups scale super quickly to help release stuff very quickly to the market by investing in them. We have a team of UI UX designers. We have teams of front-end developers, back-end developers. As you have heard before, we have testers, some project managers, and what we've recently added is that we can help our clients and startups with a 24/7 team that looks at infrastructure and customer support. And the last thing that we also can bring is some cash. And as a bonus, I would like to mention that I've also created a little ebook with the most common startup mistakes that you can actually get when you email me. And here are my contact details. So my email is fred@arcanys.com, and I encourage you to send me an email if you need to know more, if you have a project you want us to look at, or if you have any questions regarding how to manage your tech team. So I'd like to thank you a lot for watching this video, and we're gonna post a bunch more that we hope are going to be useful. And well, thanks a lot for watching. See ya.